Hi, everybody. This is FanGraphs lead prospect analyst Eric Longenhagen, and this is a board tutorial. I thought it would be useful to, maybe we should probably do this for a bunch of different tools on the site, but have a video tutorial about how to use the board for prospect analysis and what some of the stuff on there means and how I come to put it up there. So this is that video. You can access the board from a couple of different places on the site. The first is you can just hover over the prospects link on the homepage. This menu drops down. You can click the board. If you're on the prospects homepage, which you click on by clicking prospects home, it's got a bunch of different goodies. Some of which, man, can't wait till there are minor league stats generated here in 2020 again. But there's plenty to do on this page, as well as access the board here via this link that says go to the board, which I bet most of our readers could have guessed. And then that takes you here. And this is the board homepage, and you'll see that there are three main tabs at the top. Okay, one of them is, it looks a lot like our minor league leaderboards from the past. It's sortable. You can do custom reports, but it's all stat-based. It's got the standard suite of minor league stats that you're used to seeing here on FanGraphs. It's a great place to look at minor league swinging strike rates. I think it might be the only place to do that on the internet, but it is all stat-based. And then in the middle, there's a combo board. This is like the chocolate vanilla swirl section of the board, where it's a mix of the tool grades, the old school scouting tool grades, and a collection of relevant pillar type of stats, OBP, slugging, strikeout and walk rates, stuff that's pretty important when we're talking about prospect analysis or just player analysis in general. See, here's the mix for the pitchers. And the part of the board that I want to focus on today, though, is the scouting only section. While I certainly am using these other two tabs quite a bit, just on my own, maybe at some point these will have their own tutorial video where I'll show you how to flag guys that I need to ask scouts and front offices about because of how they're performing. But this part of the board, the scouting only section, is the one where most of what I'm doing every day flows. So I want to talk a little bit today about how to dig through this stuff and what it all means and how it came to be that way. So the first thing that you're going to want to take notice to on the scouting only section of the board is these four subheaders. Okay, there's the prospect list, which is our pro prospect analysis. There are the MLB draft lists for amateurs, drop down that lets you access multiple years going back in time since the beginning of the board. International players, the format of this has recently changed, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there's this fourth one, which we call the seasonal tab. It's like a chef's special tab of sorts. Right now, it's the players who graduated from rookie status last year. But if there's an international tournament with players who you can watch and see and might be interested in, or if here's a set of baseball cards that came out that are highly sought after that I've sliced the prospects into. It's just sort of a mix of soup du jour prospect list. So this will be changing pretty consistently. And then the international tab was recently just the amateurs, but there are enough interesting pro players in foreign lands to cover here. And there's not really a central location anywhere for on the internet at all, I don't think, for people to just go learn about them all in one place. And so I thought that this would be an interesting space to do that. And still, as the amateurs are mixed through here, the annual classes of that group, so your traditional July 2s, Wilman Diaz, Pedro Pineda, Christian Santana, on their own away from Sasaki and Ha-Sung Kim, they'll just be stored here in the year-by-year tracker of the international amateurs We might have to change the title of this since they won't be signing on July 2 anymore, but they will still be stored here for posterity. All right, so back to the pro part of the list, and this is the main section. As you scroll down, you'll see that there is an overall summary tab, a scouting position tab for the hitters, scouting for pitchers, and then a physical attributes tab, which is pretty new. You can sort through all of this as well. You can sort by org, by position. You can search for, you want to know who went to Vanderbilt, who's been written about on the prospect list. You can type Vanderbilt into the search bar, and it'll search all the board records for where the player signed from, and they'll be able to populate. You can filter by age and various tool grades. There's a lot of functionality up here that can just sort of be explored and played with. If we're talking about what some of the stuff in the tables on the board mean, well, you can see current level is pretty self-explanatory, and if you hover over all of these, thanks to Sean Dolinar's brilliance, really, there's a little tooltip which helps explain what some of these are in real time as you're just interacting with the site. Okay. But let's start with some of the stuff that maybe requires a little bit more explanation. You have your rankings, you have your trends, which are really more active during the season than in the off season when this column isn't really active at all. And then we have future value. Okay, there's a link to a whole column-long explanation here about what future value is. This is the all-encompassing single number that I try to use to express the prospect's value via trade and kind of to show that the guy up here and the guy down here are relatively similar, even though there's about 10 spots on this list between them. And really, it's a device used to map wins above replacement production to the 2080 scale. Okay, so I use the old school 2080 scale where 50 is big league average and just map that to a bucket of annual WAR production that is about the big league average. So everybody who is a 50 future value or above is an everyday big leaguer of some kind, and it's just trying to tell you how good of a big leaguer they are. And then below the 50 line is a role. Seth Smith and Freddie Galvis and Matt Joyce are classic 45s. They're good long-term big leaguers. They are fourth outfielders to an extent, or super utility types to an extent, but they're generating about this much annual WAR in that role, right? Good platoon outfielders. About this much WAR. Manny Margot is in this range. And then the 40s are bench players only. Not really in the lineup very often. Really only in a reserve type of role. A lot of the corner bats who hit off the bench fall into this bucket. And then beneath that on the future value scale as far as prospects are concerned, well, I'll talk about that momentarily. But that is what future value is supposed to try to express. And what this is getting at is the average annual WAR production over those first 6 or 7 years, depending on how the player's debut was manipulated by the club, of WAR production. It makes sense to do it this way, in my opinion, rather than some of the older traditional ways of doing it where you're projecting to the player's prime. So for a lot of older scouts, that's like age 28 and beyond. Whereas in my opinion, you're scouting what the player is going to do in the age 28 through 30 season while they're in the big leagues for a while. Like, it doesn't make sense to look at an 18-year-old and try to project him when he's 28. You want to project him to when he's 23 and he has to be put on your 40-man and maybe in the big leagues in a significant way. So I'm looking at those first 6 years of team control. ETA is also pretty self-explanatory, right? It's the year that I expect the prospect to debut in the big leagues. This could be more granular. I think the aim of Jason Martinez and I is to eventually make this a little bit more specific rather than just the year. Right now, this is mostly dictated by when is the player's 40-man roster deadline, right? Like what November or December does he have to be put on the 40-man, or else he's eligible for the Rule 5 draft. And then the following year is more likely than not what I'm making the ETA. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Most teams, especially now, are looking to delay their players' debut in the big leagues as much as possible, especially if they already have somebody good who's there. It doesn't make sense to add, even if someone's ready, add someone to the 40-man before you have to, if you've already got a good big leaguer in that position. There are some individual cases where the guys are just coming so fast that I'll adjust this up manually. Or if someone's super raw, I'll dial it down manually. But I don't always think to do that. And certainly I don't always know about the players enough, because there are like 2,000 of them on here, to know exactly how the org feels about that aspect of their development. But that is how ETA works right now. And like I said, Jason Martinez and I have eyes on making this a little bit more specific in the future. Then we have the risk column, which really, it says risk because you can't fit variance nice and clean in a skinny little column like this. So it says risk, but really what it means is the prospect's outcome variance. Whereas here's some instances of low variance guys, it's often players who are closer to the big leagues or who don't strike out a lot. Like there's something about their profile that makes it relatively stable. And then the high variance guys are farther away from the big leagues, or they have a terrible approach, or we don't know if their swing is going to work at the big league level, or something like that, that makes them risky, or their year-to-year outcomes potentially highly variable. And I think this also applies to the Carlos Gomez type of big leaguer, where some years are really fat and some years are really lean from a production standpoint. Often the two types of variance, whether it's variance as a prospect long-term or variance as a big league performer year to year, in my mind, they often overlap. And so you can think of this, especially with players who are close to the big leagues, as a way of gauging both of those. Then we have age, height, weight. Pretty simple. I wonder if I have anybody bats B for both rather than switch by accident, but it doesn't look like that, so that's good. And then I have a complete collection of every prospect's signing bonus. And this may be updated in fits and starts going forward, but thanks to Kylie McDaniel for doing a bunch of this work before he left for ESPN, and I was able to complete it after he left. So I'd really like there to be a way to store all of this somewhere after these prospects start to graduate, because once they graduate and get peeled off the board, you lose this information. So one of the long-term goals of this space on the site is to store all of this, again, for things like research, and it's just a really convenient place to go and find all of this information at one time. And this is one of those things that people who are writing about baseball or trying to learn about baseball might want to know and understand, that I'm trying to create a storage facility for here online. Then we have where the player is signed from, whether it's their school out of which they were drafted or the country of origin. And then there's the report and video column where you can click on the clipboard, and then the scouting report from the prospect list will pop up on your screen. And for the top 100 guys, there's a little like one-liner snippet too at the beginning if you're really in a hurry. And the video is from our YouTube channel. So you can see this is just a YouTube video that's embedded here via this link. And so you can toggle around and watch as many guys as we have footage of, and learn about prospects in this high-level biographical way on this, the summary tab. Okay, let's move on to the scouting position player tab. So we looked at the summary tab with the high-level bio information, and now here is the position players scouting tab. This is where the tool grades for the hitters get put. You can sort both by the future grade of the tool and the present grade of the tool. So if you want to see like who do I think has the most advanced bat in the minors right now based on sorting this way, you can do that. And then you can see who I have projected to have the best hit tool in the minors just by clicking either the PV or the FV. Now, how do I go about determining these? So you'll see that I wanted to use the 20s and the 30s in a way that I felt was more instructive. The premise of the present tool grades are, if you dropped this player in the big leagues right now, how well would they do? And I think for a lot of the very young players in baseball, that it's just not possible to do that, right? If I'm looking at these players who are currently on the board right now, and here's Jason Dominguez even, the highest profile 18-year-old on the planet. There's not really a way of us knowing how he would do if he were dropped in the big leagues tomorrow. There really is not. And so what I try to do is make these present hit tool grades standardized. For teenage hitters, a 20 is just neutral or negative, indicating that like these guys are pretty raw as hitters. Whereas the 25, again, for the teenage hitters, means that for their age, they're relatively advanced. And so what you'll see is the guys with the 25 present hit tool grades are the ones who have the big impact future hit tool grades. But if you wanted to see who the advanced teenagers were on the board, I could say, all right, so here's the age filter. I want players who are under 20. And I can hit apply. And then I can look for their present hit tool grades. And you'll see that Wander Franco, I have a 6 on for reasons because he's Wander Franco, basically. But everybody else here is either about to turn 20, and so I've preemptively 30'd them, or has an advanced or raw hit tool designation for their present grade, right? And again, it's just because I think it's more telling. It tells you something that either this is raw for a teenager or it is advanced for a teenager. And then the same thing applies for the what I call college-aged hitters. So any player basically between age 20 and 22, I'm doing the same thing for them, except it's with the 30 and the 35 rather than 20 and 25. So here's basically the same premise for the 20-year-olds, right? You can see Lency Delgado, Jair Camargo. These are either neutral or raw hit tool guys. And then the advanced types, Tyler Callahan, who was drafted because he can hit, Gilberto Celestino, Aaron Sabato, who just came out of college, very advanced, performed in a big conference. Right? It's players like this, high confidence in their hit tool, but they're about the age of college prospects who we'd be considering on the draft list. And that's how most of the present hit tool grades get doled out, right? Until the players get to AA or above. Then at that point, it is because, that's not that many players. It's only a couple levels worth of players. That at that point, I'm trying to actually gauge what they would do if they were dropped in the big leagues tomorrow. So for the upper level players, you'll see that their present hit tool grade is just what I think it would be if they were in the big leagues tomorrow. Okay. And again, I just think for the lower level players, it's really impossible to know. Even if you took Mike Trout from low A ball and said tomorrow, hey, you got to go hit in the big leagues, would he be really good at it? I don't know. And it's just never really a scenario that we ever see play out. And so for that reason, I don't think it's reasonable to expect scouts or certainly someone like me who's trying to do this at a different scale to really be able to know how good they would be if you put them in the big leagues tomorrow. And so this is the way I've decided to do it for grading the present hit tools. All right, let's talk about the components of the hit tool. As I've been going through the minors top to bottom for the last half decade or so now, it's clear that there are different reasons that players do or do not hit. Sometimes it's just because their swing is grooved and they really can't move the barrel around the zone. They don't have good hand-eye coordination. They can just sort of hit middle mistakes, and that is sort of it. And then you have the guys who either thrive or struggle because they are really good at deciding what to swing at. And so to sort of illustrate this and what each of these players has like driving the hit tool grade overall, I've created pitch selection and bat control grades. This is sort of like a scientific reductionist approach to thinking and talking about this stuff. And for the players who don't have very much, if any, big league data at all, you can see I just leave the pitch selection cell blank, basically, right? There's not even, as much as the industry has seen Petey Halpin, Petey Halpin hasn't seen pro pitching. So there maybe there's a way to do this for the really young, initially drafted guys, completely without the aid of data. But I do use the walk rates, whatever proprietary plate discipline metrics I can get my hands on from sources to try to go about evaluating guys who can take a walk, basically, right? So here's Nolan Jones, who, as I've gone through the 2021 lists to this point, is our sole 80. And he runs something like a 20% walk rate for his career, right? This is as high as it goes. It's the three true outcomes type of hitters who will end up on the higher end of this scale. And then if I were to sort it the other way, you can see that it's guys with real chase issues who really like to swing, who are towards the bottom here. So this is gonna be the type of player who runs walk rates south of 7%. Typically would be someone who's in here. And you can get fooled by some of these guys, but Josh Vitters and whatever. But you can see that for someone like Kyber Ruiz and Tyler Freeman, that the fact that they have this level of bat control, the ability to move the barrel around the hitting zone, to things like plate coverage and hand-eye coordination, whatever prevents them from swinging and missing, especially on pitches in the zone, is what's going to drive this grade. So there are certainly players who can make an overall profile work with just one of these two things. But when you have the types of players who are near the top of both spectrums, that's where you're going to get your elite hitters. So, Wander Franco is really exceptional in just about every way. He's one of those here as well. Andrew Vaughn with the White Sox. And you can see some other players, like a lot of these Cleveland players, which they love to take in the draft, don't have big time juice, not a lot of power in Jose Fermin and Tyler Freeman and Stephen Kwan, but they know what to swing at and they can get the bat to just about anything. So it's an interesting mix, still playing with the way I think and go about doing this, especially for these younger players who there's just no help. Like, I know what I think of Rhys Hines, just me personally, in both of these categories, and that it's going to lead to this. But I don't have enough statistical supporting evidence to do that at scale for everyone, especially a lot of the players who I haven't seen. Let's talk about power. You see I have game power. There's the tooltip for game power. And you see I have raw power. There's the tooltip for raw power. Raw power is what it is. It's graded visually. For some of the players, it might be aided by the high end of their exit velocities, which are also here on the right side of the board. I've got the average exit velocities. These are still 2019 minor league numbers as of right now, because we don't have anything from 2020. Here's the hard hit rate, which is the same hard hit rate that you're familiar with from other parts of this site and at Baseball Savant. Balls in play at 95 miles an hour or above. And then here's the max exit velocity. Now, this is interesting, right? Because as I've sourced these from teams, I've come to find that the way that this gets not calculated but tracked can vary from team to team. That some teams are lopping off the top handful of readings to prevent from any outliers creeping in or misreads. I think if you go to Nick Madrigal's Big League Statcast page, actually might as well just do it now, you'll see what I'm talking about with the with regard to some of these outliers. So you can access some Statcast stats on our site. If I go to a player page here, here's the Statcast tab. You can see there's a little new flag on there. And I can I can hover over game log and then click on Statcast. And I can look at Nick Madrigal's game by game max exit velocities. And so here's a 1/112. And you'll see that he never comes near that anywhere else. And maybe that's because this is a smaller sample, but I'm inclined to believe that this is an outlier. It's a rarity. It's not a reflection of his true talent. That his max, when he's really squaring up a ball, is going to look more like this, 103, 105. And so I understand why teams want to try to wipe these types of readings off of the top of the way their system displays max exit velocity to them. So as you look at the max exit velocities on the board, know that depending on where I got some of these from, it might be calculated differently. So like Daniel Johnson hit a ball 116 in the fall league, but the teams that lop those outliers off, it might say like 110 for him or something like that. So these are going to be a mix of that, which is imperfect, and I'm working on that, but it at least is a thing for readers to know. So how about speed? Speed, what if I told you there was a tool that could fit in your pocket, and unlike sprint speed, which just measures peak speed over a short area, this measures some combination of that and the player's acceleration, their rate of acceleration plus their peak speed together, and it fits in your pocket. It's a stopwatch. How about that? I still just think, look, I think sprint speed is useful and interesting. Certainly, I was the adolescent who watched the whole NFL Combine, so I love stuff like that. But if I'm trying at scale to measure meaningful speed, then I still just think the stopwatch is the way to go. That run, that sprint from home to first is the most important one in baseball, in my opinion. Right? It's the difference between there being an out or not. So very important. And so I think using the stopwatch to measure that is still just the right way to go. And the scale is pretty well defined. And it's actually, I wrote something a long time ago that isn't on the internet anymore. Rest in peace, Crash Bernally. But the difference between left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters getting down the line is actually a little bit bigger on average than just a tenth of a second. It's actually closer to 0.2. And anyway, measuring stuff with a stopwatch on TV in 2020 was impossible because of the timing of the camera cuts. There was clearly a larger gap than usual between the cut from the center field camera to the wide shot of the infield with the runner touching the base as the defense tries to throw him out. So these are all in person or video collected or just, told to us by a source. But that is basically what I'm looking for, is the stopwatch reading from home to first here. All right, and finally on the position player scouting tab is defense. Defense is much like raw power in that the present grade often is what it is. I think that this might adjust at some point. The way I do this might shift, especially as defensive positioning starts to make it so worse defenders can kind of reasonably play different infield positions. It's rare to find, I wonder, what are my lowest present defense grades? Okay, you have the guys who I just don't think can play defense, right? Yerman Mercedes is DH. Charles Mack is just converting from the infield to catching. So some of these guys who can barely stick at whatever position they're projected to play, especially these big-bodied infielders who are going to try to move up the defensive spectrum in pro ball. Tyler Callahan, Aaron Bracho is not a very good defensive second baseman, right? The Dan Uggla type guys who are really net negatives defensively, but you put them there because you just really want to have their bat in the lineup every day. These will be towards the bottom. I look at 35 in this case. Michael Busch is a great example as replacement level, where I think it won't be so bad that you go, man, we really need to take this guy off the field or move him to first base soon. But it isn't quite below average. Like it's really not good. It's barely acceptable. Shed Long at second base has basically become that. And so I'm trying to use as much of the scale here as possible. It is a thing that has been, I think, pretty narrow in public. The way we all collectively talk about defense and put tool grades on defense in the public sphere, I think is pretty vanilla and like generic and not really informative at all. For some of the guys, it absolutely is, right? Some of these high-end defensive players, we're really telling you what we think about them, but I think for the most part, there's a lot of 45ing and 50ing as far as the defensive grades are concerned, and trying to move away from that, but in a way that makes sense rather than just to do it. So again, looking for ways to describe rather than precision about the 2080 scale in its initial premises. Let's talk about the relatively new physical attributes tab. You can see I moved the arm strength over here. I just don't think it's as important as the other tools. It saved me a row on the position player scouting tab. And I also think that arm strength evaluation would benefit from a reductionist type approach where the max effort can really step into it type of arm strength is separated from more or less arm utility. Can you make all these crazy throws that really good big league infielders have to be able to make? In the hole, you backhand a ball, you plant your right foot, and you throw it over there as hard as you can. Or you're coming in on the grass, it's a high chopper, and you're fielding a short hop off your shoe tops, and you're bent at the waist, and have to kind of make one of those underhanded throws over there. Like, these are all different types of things that get lost if all you care about is how fast does this guy throw the ball across the infield. So I think it's very difficult to apply that type of thinking at scale. It's really a thing you have to do, but from watching a player over and over and over again to have enough opportunities to see them make all of those different types of plays. And you could argue that evaluating that is tied into other attributes like their actions and their athleticism. But for now, arm strength is some combination of those two things. It's max effort, if they really reach back and let it go, how fast is it? And what is the arm utility? So Jose Garcia in the Red system, that guy can throw a seed to any base from anywhere on the infield. And also, when he really cuts it loose, it hums over there. So he's a 70, whereas some of these other guys are clearly not. Whether that's really reach back and throw it or from like an athleticism, mobile quarterback type of throw the ball over the infield. All right. Some of these other columns are frame. There's the tooltip for that. Athleticism. You can see that it's, again, a mix of runs fast, jumps high, and these other elements: grace, body control, flexibility, coordination. That fits into athleticism as well. Their performance. In this case, it's, hey, does this guy's statistical performance either support or detract from their prospectum? And then delivery is just for pitchers, and it's about repeatability and the arm action and some of the violence or not. Again, you could argue there's some overlap here with athleticism, which I think is fine. But does this physical trait have a positive or negative impact on the player's prospectum? So for frame, pretty self-explanatory. it's the guys who look like NFL quarterbacks, basically. It's the big, strong, strapping, broad-shouldered, really well-built, cut, this type of athlete. And some of these names on here, if you're looking at this list, you're picturing them and you know what I'm talking about. And then it also applies to long-term body projection. So Dasan Brown and Kevin Alcantara are not those types of physical entities just yet, but they have a chance to really be, right? These are the types of Michael Mercado, 6'5" pitcher who might add 20 pounds of muscle without you noticing because his frame is so big and throw really hard as a result. So these are the types of players whose frames portend athletic longevity or some amount of physical projection. And then the other side of the spectrum is the husky guys or the really short, projectionless types. And again, many of these names you can picture in your mind's eye and see, oh yeah, like Nate Pearson's he's built kind of soft. Like there's not really anything that's going to get stacked onto his body that's going to help him throw any harder. His frame is kind of maxed out and really can only regress. So he gets a single minus. And Luis Patino is not in bad shape, but he's little. So there's not much more to add onto his body. He's already added like 40 pounds or something like that since he signed. So there's no projection left on the frame. And then, yeah, you have like your husky tough skin guys here in the minus category, led by Alejandro Kirk, who is, I think emblematic of the group as a whole. All right, athleticism. This is a visual evaluation. This is maybe my favorite thing to evaluate. What this means long term, I truly don't know, other than the guys who play Major League Baseball 9 times out of 10 are incredible athletes. And so this is the top of the scale for those types of guys. It is the ones who I think represent all of these smaller attributes, I guess, like where they do run fast and they can jump high and they are explosive and have great body control and grace and do spectacular things. And then you can see that the reverse of this is the first base only type or the really bad defensive infielders. Okay, some folks have seen Guillermo Zuniga try to field a bunt. You know what this is, why this is here, right? So it's a mix of this type of stuff. It's to track and explain part of why the player is projected upon or liked long term. And it's the type of thing that I think I'm more tracking now than saying has real merit. It's just the type of thing that hopefully over time, if we're looking at this retrospectively, might be able to tell us something about the players. And then performance is self-explanatory. I'm still adjusting how I minus players in terms of performance. Certainly there are some obvious examples like Joe Boyle, who walks everybody. He's got a minus performance. And then there are some other more difficult ones to peg, like Jason Dominguez is minus in performance because nobody's seen him play. And so you can't argue, like, the fact that he has no track record of performance makes him hard to stuff at the very top of the prospect spectrum, but he's got this and the huge physical ability, but this is definitely weighing his value down, and where he ranks on the list, it's pulling it down because he hasn't played. Same with Yoelqui Cespedes, who's going to be 24 later this year and hasn't played baseball in like a couple of different years. But so you'll see a lot of the Cuban guys who haven't played in quite a while on here for that reason, just because there's no track record of performance. And it's been a while since we've seen them, and it's scary. And it has to drag down their overall valuation. And then delivery, again, I think most people listening to this and watching this know what this means. It's does the delivery look nice? Is it repeatable? Is it athletic and graceful again? You could argue it overlaps here. And increasingly, does the delivery help impact movement on the guy's stuff? So Clayton Beater doesn't really repeat, but his delivery is like James Karinchak's. And it means that his stuff is like huge carry. Oliver Drake would be another one where he's so deceptive because of his delivery. His delivery is part of what is driving his effectiveness. And so he'd be up here. Like, does the guy's mechanics have a real impact on how their stuff plays? You can see I've been kind of stingy giving out the plus deliveries here so far this offseason. And then towards the bottom of that spectrum, it's, wow, is this really violent and gross? Is this totally unrepeatable? Does this guy have no feel to pitch at all? Well, then he's going to be way down here. And there's going to be, I feel like there's going to be a weird reverse correlation here, because the guys who are almost always down here have ungodly stuff. And that's the reason that anyone lets them pitch at all is because their stuff is just so good that you never go, hey, can you tone that down and maybe not look like a, oh gosh, what's the guy's name? Like a Francis Bacon painting when you're throwing the baseball there. But yeah, this is what the bottom of the delivery spectrum looks like for me. Even though I think these players are good prospects, they still lose value. They still lose position in the prospect continuum, probably a better way of saying it, because their deliveries scare me. Let's return to future value. And remember I showed you this where we're mapping the 2080 scale to average annual WAR production during the years of team control. There are a couple other distinctions in this area that I want to talk about now, and also summarize how I go about fitting a hitter to a corresponding future value. There have been a couple one-for-one trades involving draft picks and players that help triangulate where certain types of teams, and by certain types I mean where they fit on the competitive spectrum, with how they value that draft pick. So the Alex Claudio trade, where the Brewers swapped a comp pick, like 42nd overall or something like that, for Alex Claudio, who they non-tendered the 2 consecutive years after that. It tells you that the Brewers said, we're competing right now. We want a good reliever. Anyone who we're going to draft at 42, if it's a college pitcher and they become a good reliever, we'd be stoked on that. So why not just trade that pick for someone who is that right now? And that makes some sense. And as you go down the future value spectrum here, and you say, all right, what player do you like more? Alex Kirilloff or Blake Hunt? It's pretty objective that I want Kirilloff rather than Hunt. And then the lower you go, especially as you get towards the back of the players who I have projected as 50s, the answer becomes, well, it depends. Right? If you're the Phillies, you don't really want Ryan Jeffers. You have JT Realmuto. You'd rather take someone who's not going to occupy a spot on your 40-man roster, who might play a position that you need later on. And Ryan Jeffers as a player doesn't trump all of that. He's a really good player, but he doesn't trump all of that on his own like some of these guys up toward the top would. If you go, hey, who do you want? Xander Bogaerts or Wander Franco? I'd like Wander Franco. Bogaerts is an all-star player, but this guy trumps that, even if I have Bogaerts already. Right? So as we descend further and further down the future value spectrum, you start to see more of a blending of players who are far away from the big leagues but have upside, high variance types, and players who are a little closer to the big leagues but don't have as much ceiling. I just think the further down the spectrum you go, the more likely you are to answer the question, hey, which of these two guys would I rather have, with, it depends. It depends on what team I am. It depends on where I am on the competitive spectrum. It depends who's already on my roster. And so the way I try to fold these types of questions, the way I try to answer that question is by using the draft as a filter for those types of players. So when Alex Claudio gets traded for the 42nd overall pick, then I know that I should be valuing the player who's picked 42nd overall pretty close to the way I would evaluate a prospect like Alex Claudio on here. So you have Ian Seymour, who's 22. He was drafted out of Virginia Tech. He was given $1.2 million in the last year's draft. He's a lefty with pretty good stuff. I've got a multi-inning relief projection on him. Okay, I think if a team were to trade that pick for someone who did that in the big leagues right now, that would be a pretty even trade. Okay, and the 40+ designation and the 45+ designation indicates players who I think have real helium up above this distinction, but that based on what they've done to this point, they're valued basically as a 45. It's a lot of players who I do think have a chance of really popping, rather than some of these more certain types. It's much less likely for me to stick a plus designation on a hitter who is close to the big leagues. At that point, I just want to make a call as to what the role is going to be without the plus. Although there are some players, here's Gabriel Arias is a good example, where the physical ability is so exceptional that I will still do it. And so Franchi Cordero, Estevan Florial for a while, guys with really premium tools, maybe I'll stick the 40, I'll plus them in some way. But for the most part, when a hitter's getting closer to the big leagues, I want to just have a grade without the plus designation. All right. Another good way to think about this is to look at current big leaguers and ask yourself the question, where, if you know a hitter is going to produce like any of these guys, where do they belong on your list? And for me specifically, what future value grade are you handing them? And again, it's mapping annual WAR production on average during years of team control to the 2080 scale. So let's do some examples. Okay, here's Rendon, Anthony Rendon. If I know someone is going to produce like this during the course of their career, here's 35 total WAR, and we only want the years of the Nationals control here. So it's really closer to 33 wins above replacement over the course of Rendon's career with the Nationals. That's 7 years. And that's just shy of 5 WAR. It's 4.7-ish annual WAR. And he had this year where he missed half a season because of injury. And so that's, if I'm mapping that to the 2080 scale, okay, and remember I showed you this. Here's 5 WAR. That's a 70. So Rendon was at 4.7, missed half a year because of injury. You want to round up because of that. You want to prorate it. That seems fine. Rendon's a 70. He's not Trout. He's not an elite generational talent, but he's really good. Yeah, so put a 70 on Anthony Rendon. That feels right. Let's do somebody else. Let's see, someone who's less good. Let's go to the back of our qualified guys from 2020. Oh, Josh Reddick is great. All right. So Josh Reddick. Josh Reddick's been around forever, right? We all know what he is. He had these years where he was an exceptionally good defensive corner outfielder, which made up for some of his platoony offensive elements. But because he hit left-handed, he had a platoon advantage most of the time. We're looking at him, 19 WAR, In total, during his years of team control before free agency, that's closer to 15, which puts him at just over 2 annual WAR on average, which, again, if I'm looking at the scale, I should have just kept it up in a different tab, but here we go. That's a 50. And again, that feels right. And I think that's an important part of this. Yes, there's analysis that has driven me to do this, right? Like I just looked at the historical WAR production on a bell curve and came up with these ranges basically on my own. But from looking at the historical data, but it should also feel right if we apply it to anybody from today. And so again, Reddick, he's about a 50. There's some platoon elements to his offense, but he was a good enough defensive player at peak to go from being a 45 type platoon bat to a 50. And that's the level at which he produced during his years of team control. Let's do one more. Let's reduce our plate appearance qualifications here. Who's a good one? All right, so here's one. Here's Dansby Swanson. Here's an example of how initially I wasn't great at this, right? I had a 65 future value on Swanson. So if we're looking, there's the book. Right, that's somewhere between where Rendon produced and an all-star. And absolutely, I think Swanson at peak is that type of player. And certainly over our 60-game shortened 2020 season, you prorate that over the course of a season. That's the type of year he was on pace to have. But he hasn't been that player on average during the course of these many years. Right? He's only generated 6 WAR over the course of 3.5 seasons, basically. And that's closer to being a 50. And his peak is above that, absolutely. But that's the thing that should be described on the board as variance. Right? I don't want to use the future value grade to describe his peak. I'd rather call him a high variance 50. So here's another instance where just projecting the peak output is sort of an issue. Here's Carlos Gomez. Okay, so these 2 years where Gomez is, especially in 2013, a borderline MVP candidate does not mean that his grade overall, if I'm trying to bake his grade into one number or expression or phrase, this does not dictate it. It does not describe his totality sufficiently enough to go, well, he's a 70. He produced in this year at peak like a 70. I want to take a broader look and a broader approach. And this is what a mess this is to try to add up just because of how up and down this guy's career has been. But yeah, what even the hell would I say he is? But you can see that the point is to try to evaluate the player's tenure during those years of team control as a whole, while using the variance piece to describe players like this, who are high variance year-to-year types of performers. So let's look at a pretty blasé example of a prospect. I did this recently for the Pirates list in the top 100. So here's Manny Margot. I'm going to open him in a new tab, and then let's take a look at Travis Swaggerty. Now, I've got access to more data than I can show you on the site, but I can't show it to you on my screen recording because it might get my sources fired. So we're going to take a look at the data that I do have on a prospect who I'm evaluating and trying to put an FV on, in this case, Travis Swaggerty, who I'm a little bit more aggressive with than I think some of my peers have been, which isn't to say I'm right. It's just showing you how this approach turns out a 50 for Travis Swaggerty. All right, so here's Manny Margot. Margot to this point, and his years of team control are not done, but he's tracking like a 45, basically. He's got this 1-2 win year. He's got the win and a half year, and then he has this lesser 2018 season. and prorated over the course of a season, his 2020 raise here is another 45 type of year, right? About a win and a half on average per year, right? Here's the 45. Low end regular or platoon outfielder. Margot can really go get it in center field. He has good platoon splits against lefties, but he's vulnerable and ineffective for the most part offensively against righties. So I like that guy as a 45 heuristically, and he's producing like that. So here's Swaggerty. And you can see I overprojected Margot as a prospect too. See? I just thought that he would do more damage against both types of pitching rather than only lefties. And you can see that his raw power grades are, I think these are still accurate, right? He had average raw power as a young guy. I think it's above now, but his swing just does not allow for it to play in games. So I think I got this part of it right, but the overall grade I did not get right. So Swaggerty is similar. Big raw power. His swing has never been really truly dialed in. He just does not hit the ball in the air enough to take advantage of all this raw power. So I have his game power projected below it. Right? Field to hit is okay. It has to do with his swing path. And like Margot, this guy can really play center field. Swaggerty's so good in center field. Instincts are fantastic, and he can really run. All right, so why the 45 grade on Margot, right? It's what he's turned into. But a 50 on Swaggerty, who projects to be a pretty similar player. Well, there's a chance that the swing does get dialed in, and there is relevant game power. And also, Swaggerty has the platoon advantage. He hits left-handed, whereas Margot hits right. So if I'm lining up these two guys, maybe I 45 both of them and prefer Swaggerty because of the reasons I just said. But I think the possibility that his swing gets dialed in and there is power, even if it comes later during those 6 years of team control, means that I'm going to value this guy as a 50. He's a 45 based on what he is now. But during the course of his career with Pittsburgh, even if it's 3 years down the line and he produces like, I don't know, maybe he hits 25 home runs one year or something like that, like Jackie Bradley Jr. or someone, then on balance, during those 6 years of team control, those peak years towards the back will have meant that he produced like a 50. So it's little stuff like that on the margins, handedness, the potentiality of things that shift someone who right now their skill set is, this is a 45. This is a glove first center fielder who is not going to play every day because sometimes we're going to want someone who hits left-handed pitching in there. Or sometimes we're going to be behind. And the fact that Swaggerty is a good defender just doesn't matter as much. Or someone who gets a lot of ground balls is starting that day. And it doesn't matter as much that we have a plus defensive center fielder in there. Like, his value to the team gets reduced because his situational effectiveness is not universal. But the potential for a thing like this still exists. And that's why someone like Swaggerty is here, even though the baseline that I'm comparing him to try to triangulate where his future value belongs, the type of WAR he's going to produce, based on the tools he has and his statistical performance, it starts with me bouncing off of someone like this. All right, now let's talk about pitchers for a little bit. Oh, here it is. All right, nice. So here's another specific table where I take you through the scouting scale FV mapped to the WAR production. And there's communicative dissonance between this type of thinking and candidly most of the folks who are reading our site. Because the way you guys think about number one starter, number two starter, number three starter, etc., is driven by fantasy baseball. It's driven by like the starting pitching tiers during your fantasy draft. And that's fine for you. But it's hard. I'm just trying to make an effort to bridge that gap. So what I want people to know is that when I say a guy's a number 4 starter, that's good. That's good. The fact that you're in a starting big league rotation at all means you're really good. If you're taking your turn 30 times a year, you're damn good. And so I try to expand on what that means here and here. And the FIP piece of it is important. The workload piece of it is also important. As we traverse down the future value spectrum into these areas, especially as we incorporate relievers and as modern reliever usage begins to evolve, the ways of describing who is a 45 and who is a 40 will start to grow and change. Like, there are just more ways for a pitcher to be a 40 than there are for him to be an 80. You just have to be Kershaw or Scherzer to be an 80, but you can be Joe Blanton and be a 45. You can be Cody Hoyer or Juris Familia or just a nasty setup man and be a 45, right? It starts to blend. The roles at which someone can be a certain future value start to become more diverse as we traverse down the spectrum, right? Okay, let's go over to the board again and look at the pitcher tab here. So again, this is the pro list. If I click on scouting pitching, I'm going to I have Tommy John dates in here. Some of these are garbled and I need to fix them. So I know I need to do that. But Tommy John date collection is here. I've added this season fastball type, which I think is useful at explaining why some of them, even though they're very hard or not hard, miss bats or don't. Right? As we learn more about pitching in the public space, the way the pitch moves, its approach angle, and other aspects of the pitch are also important in addition to the velocity of the fastball specifically. And you can see that some of these guys actually should probably apply this to more pitchers. Why not? Here's Luis Rijo. Luis Rijo is 22. He'll touch 96, and he kind of sits 92 to 95 for most of his starts. His curveball is really pretty, and yet I really don't have confidence in him being an effective big league arm because the way his fastball doesn't really move. Even though it's this hard, I think it's below average. I think he's the type of pitcher who's going to have to throw his curveball like half the time and really command everything. You can see I've got a 6 projected on his command, so I think he will, to get by. And that in that role, I think it's more of a 35-plus guy. It's like an up-down relief type profile for me. Even though his strike throwing is fine, he throws hard, he's got a good-looking breaking ball, not a starter for me because I don't think that this pitch actually plays. And I'm trying to indicate why that is through this describing some of the movement. And you'll see that the guys who have rising fastballs, A, they're becoming more popular, and B, it's because these are the ones that tend to miss more bats. Certainly design of two-seamers and sinkers and the ability to optimize players' location of those pitches will enable some guys to throw those sinkers under the hands of right-handed hitters and miss bats with them as well. But for the most part, it is these rising fastballs who are really blowing hitters away. And they're the ones that you're going to see a lot of the time with the 80 fastball designation. It's not universal, but it is going to be pretty frequent or just plus and above, really. Present fastball and future fastball are more about the projection of the velocity piece than of those underlying pitch characteristics that I just talked about. It's hard for, at scale, me to get everybody on the high speed and see how good they are at orienting the seams and creating seam uniformity on the baseball and spin efficiency and stuff like that. Some guys are bad at it, and the team can get a hold of them and make them better at it. And even though they're not throwing any harder, their fastball will get better. That's sort of in the dark right now for for me. I can do it for some players who I see in person and can get on the high-speed camera and say, hey, this guy's fastball, he has no idea how the hell to grip it. And a team can really help him with that. I'm not there quite yet. So this is more about projecting on the frame, projecting on the velocity, and using the underlying traits to get to a grade. But that's not, the ability to develop that is still something I'm grappling with. This is the difference between the present and future fastball grades has more to do with velocity projection. Okay. Then you have the secondary pitches. Same deal. 50 is big league average. This is another space where there's not a lot of use of the bottom of the scale in the public sphere. You'll rarely see anyone with a 20 or a 30, present or future, projected on a pitch unless maybe they're just learning it. I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to find a reason to make use of the bottom of the scale a little bit more for pitch types. But realistically, if a guy has a 20 or a 30 grade pitch, he just doesn't throw it. So it's hard to find actual examples of a 20 or a 30 grade pitch in the big leagues unless you force me to adhere in like an orthodox sense to the notion that the 20/80 scale is just active in the big leagues at all times. So that's how the secondary pitch grades come together. It's really just a visual evaluation. And then there are some instances where I'll acquire data specifically about players swinging strike rates on different pitches, and that might help inform stuff like this too. But I'm not really getting that en masse across the entire minor league baseball population. And so most of this is a visual grade when it comes to the secondary pitches. Command, I've started to do the same way I do power and hit tool for the hitter side, where when a guy gets to AA and above, then I'm putting a for real, honest to goodness grade on what I think their present command and control is. I think that there's probably a better way to talk about this as it relates to the secondary pitches. I think grading the command of each pitch, especially like slider command, is just so important to the way that pitch plays, and that maybe in the future we'll do something like that. But for now, this is just overall strike throwing ability and pitch execution. And the teenagers are going to have a present 20 if it is neutral or raw. If there's a lot of relief risk on a teenage arm, they'll have a 20. And if it's advanced for their age, their command, then you'll see a 25. And the same is true of the college age pitchers, where if it's raw or neutral in value, it'll just be a 30. And if it's advanced and polished, it'll be a 35 for like a college arm. So here's Hyun Choi in the Dodger system. Really locates, he doesn't have great stuff, but really locates. Might be a guy to pitch towards the back of the rotation because of that. So it looks like an org player on stuff, but has some upside because of the command. And so that is the way that the present command grades get distributed. And then again, once a guy is at AA or above, I just want to be grading it at that point. And yeah, sometimes that might mean, hey, what if a college arm just really has 20 grade command? I'll just put a 20 on it then. So there are going to be some exceptions, but for the most part, that is how I'm looking at it. Again, I just think it's a way to actually say what's going on there without the pretentiousness of the notion that I can tell you if Luis Perales, who's 17 and a half, was put in the big leagues tomorrow, how many strikes would he throw? I just don't know. I can tell you that for a 17-year-old, there's some relief risk here, that he looks like a reliever. And so he's got a 20. And that's what that means. This stuff, the spin rate stuff, this is also, it's incredible that we're at a point in time in baseball in 2021 when I don't have to explain this to you, but you know what this means. The thing that I will point out is the breaking ball spin rate. If a guy's got 2, this is just the higher of those 2. It's not necessarily the better of his 2 breaking balls. The spin rate of the pitch, I do think it's important, but for the most part, because of all the other attributes that have an impact on the way secondary stuff works. The RPM itself isn't a proxy for the breaking ball grade over here. I just think it's interesting to know if a guy can spin the ball or not. So I'm taking the higher of the two breaking ball spin rates if a guy's got to, even if it's not the better of the two breaking balls, just as a way of illustrating, hey, this guy can really spin it. You can see the upper and lower end of the prospects who I've done so far. Some commonality in the orgs here. And then the velocity band and peak velocity, this is sourced pretty objectively. I found that it's pretty easy for me to get a hold of a list of the 10th and 90th percentile fastball velocities that any of the pitchers in the minors are throwing. So, people feel free to send me a spreadsheet of that stuff because it's not that important. Certainly velocity is a huge deal, but there's enough other stuff going on with all these guys that is meaningful that my sources don't feel scared sending me a list of velocity bands and peak velos. So these are all objective from the 2019 season still, and we'll just update them as quickly as we can throughout 2021 so that they're up to date, and you can follow the prospect account on Twitter to see when those updates are coming through. Okay. So here's the pitching leaderboard from 2020. Let's test this out again. Let's find some guys who have signed as free agents recently. So Hyunjin Ryu will be interesting since he came over from Korea. And, sure, Trevor Bauer just signed, right? So that's an easy one. Okay. So here's Bauer. Here's the primer again. Okay, so Bauer over 7 seasons generated 20 WAR. And we'll prorate the 2020 season. Of all the things I thought would throw kind of a monkey wrench into doing things this way, I wouldn't have thought it would be a pandemic. But here we are. So if we give Bauer a full season of 33 starts in 2020, it's another 5 WAR. So that's 25 WAR. And divide that by his 7 seasons of team control, then we're at about 3 to 4 wins above replacement on average. And that's in this range, in the 60s, 60 future value guy. You can see that pitchers get punished more than hitters just because they're more often beset by injury and can't do the innings workload thing. But a 60 feels right for Bauer. Now, he just won the Cy Young and has been better than a 60 for the last 3 years, basically. But again, I don't care about what he's going to be now for the Dodgers. It's about what he is during the years of team control. The Dodgers don't think about signing Trevor Bauer and go, well, how good was he when he was 20? Like, they're not thinking about what he was when he was a prospect when they're thinking about signing him to a free agent deal. So why would I be thinking about his post-free agent deal years when I'm evaluating him as an amateur prospect? So all the adjustments that he made, the fact that it took time for him to get to this point where he's unbelievable, all of that just gets baked into what you think he'll be based on the quality of his stuff at the time. But of course, he had adjustments to make. So that's actually kind of instructive, actually, that this guy was struggling with walks for quite a while and then still ended up being a 60. I wonder if he would have been there had I been doing the list. Let's look at Hyunjin Ryu. He's been around a little while now, too. Wow. Oh, see, he's a tough one, though, because he has been hurt a lot. And I think that manually putting your thumb on the scale for guys like this, or reducing their value based on their history of injury. If it's just one injury hiccup, like we talked about with Rendon before, then I think it's fine to consider that year in a prorated sense. Whereas for someone like Ryu, who was hurt a bunch of times, to say that it reduces what his future value should be, I think is also fair. But you can see 17 WAR, 6 years. He started that year right away with him, didn't he? So we're really looking at about 15 WAR over 6 years, which is still about a 60, even though he missed a bunch of time. And again, I think that feels right for both of these guys. And I think that's an important part of using this as a tool and a way of doing things, is that as we look back retroactively at a lot of these players, that where we think they should belong based on the methodology does feel right. If I'm going to put someone who I know is Trevor Bauer on my prospect list, having him in that 60 future value tier where he's in the top 25, basically, I think that's about right. Let's try another one who's not as good as these guys, though, because it should work for everybody. And again, anything below a 50, the thing that I'm aiming to describe more accurately than the annual WAR production is their role, right? So let's just widen our scope to the last 6 years. All right. So for relievers, if you know someone's going to be Aroldis Chapman, where do they belong on your prospect list? It's a really difficult question. And it begs the question, how do you value an elite reliever like this? And I think that the WAR component punishes relievers, trying to make a manual adjustment for that. Like, this is a historically good closer, right? But over the last 6 years, she's been worth about 14 wins. And that's a 50-55, right? It's a little over the 2 wins per year line. And for a closer, that feels right. If you were looking at Aroldis Chapman as a starting pitching prospect in Louisville in 2008 or whenever that was, and said, there's a lot of relief risk here. He's sitting like 94 for most of the outing, but losing some steam late. So early on from the windup, he's pumping 102, and then from the stretch and later in the outing, it's coming way down. So there's a lot of relief risk here. I think you probably 55 that guy. Now, I do think that the argument that the WAR-based measures of evaluating relievers that ignore what they're doing from a leverage standpoint, especially as teams get better at deploying them in the proper leveraged situations, it does underrate them. And so adjusting for that, I think, is going to be important. Having some of the better relievers of the last half decade or so on the prospect lists as starters who sort of fall into being elite relievers, I think protects against some of this type of thing. But as you can see on the prospect lists of late, let me get to the pitchers. Ooh, how does that? Can I just reset these? Yeah. Oh, I know what it's doing. Okay. Well, I'll have to tell Sean about that. But if I'm just looking at the pitchers here, now I'm designating starters, single inning relievers, multi-inning relievers, and I'm just growing more likely to bucket some of these really high-end multi-inning relief types in the top 100 worthy future value category and above. And so if I watch Luis Medina and you said, hey, this guy's going to be an elite closer one day, then he probably belongs up above this, even though he's only 21 and is still really wild. And part of the problem with players like him who are close to the big leagues from a 40-man standpoint, but not really close to the big leagues from a technical development standpoint, is that you're trying to weigh the upside with the risk that he's nothing at all into the future value bucket as well. So I don't proclaim to have all the answers. This is just the way I've taken to doing things. I'm always open to constructive, thoughtful feedback because I'm trying to push this medium forward. I've been in baseball now. 2021 will be my 13th year in the game in some capacity. And I've been at this full-time prospect writer thing this will be my 5th. Yeah. So tons of room for improvement, I think, both in my work and generally. I think that being open about how I go about doing it is useful because exposing who knows how many of you to this way of thinking through your ear holes, if you haven't read the book, which I'll now plug, I think can be useful to get some feedback and start to grow the next generation of prospect writer, man. Like if you're 16, 17 years old and you love baseball or just evaluating players in any sport, if you're an NFL draft hound or like to watch the NBA combine and think about some of the statistical models that are generating thought in the NBA right now, then you're the type of person who I think would get some use out of this tutorial, maybe the book, and maybe one day down the road, a thoughtful conversation about methodology. Because my hope is that someone takes this torch and runs with it one day. So I'd like to start building the foundation of thought with young people now. So thank you for enjoying, hopefully, this tutorial. And I'll see you over in the electronic pages of FanGraphs.com.